Heidi's on her way. She's trying to get in.
Herman and Sharon, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for being willing to come chat to us. My apologies for my delay in getting here. I don't know what was up with my computer. It obviously didn't want me to join today, but we fixed it somehow. Amy got in there and fixed it, and Robin was there. So thank you, and thank you to Joan for being here. And I know there are other people who are going to watch the recording. They couldn't unfortunately make it today. I got apology emails, which doesn't happen often, but I got these emails saying, "Oh, that's so cool. I'm so sorry I can't make it." So you will have viewers now and later. So please go ahead.
Awesome. Can I start actually by asking to hear a little bit about the Visitor Studies and Interpretation Group?
Sure.
I do curious about the organization, the group, and what some of your meetings are like. I just want to make sure that I'm presenting this in the context that is relevant to the work that you all are doing.
Sure, not a problem. We started 10 years ago, and what we are is we're a group of professionals who came together and decided that we actually need a meeting place where people can learn from each other, ask each other questions, get new ideas, so that we can improve the interpretation in South Africa and make sure that we make our experiences even better for the future. So we have members who are front of house guides, we have members who are curators, some are CEOs, mostly for us from South Africa, but some members, we have members from Uganda, we have one or two from the UK. So we have from around the world here and there, but mostly we are based in South Africa.
Absolutely.
Herman, maybe our coffee chats are really so that we can get together, share information, be able to ask each other questions. So our coffee chats are really informal. So don't feel like you need to present at a conference. And it really is just about us networking and learning and sharing knowledge with each other.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I appreciate the context. I think with that in mind, I'm going to keep this slide deck relatively brief. I'll focus more on how we were thinking about the trip, some of the research that we were interested in while we were there. But then I want to leave time at the end for discussion, just so I can get to any clear points. Is that okay? Yep.
Perfect. The discussion, the part we all love.
All right, lovely. Okay, let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, can you all see my screen okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. Okay, as I mentioned before, my name is Herman Marigny. I'm joined by my colleague Sharon Anderson, and we are from the National African American Museum, but specifically representing the Office of Visitor and Guest Services. We are a front-facing team within the museum who primarily deal with the pre-visit kind of communications going to our visitors, the on-site experience, connecting visitors to the experiences that they're most interested in and making recommendations on how they spend their time with us at the institution. And then more recently, post-visit data and analysis. So we process a number of visitor surveys, turn those into reports, and then use those reports to improve operations. And it was an extension of the work, the part that we were learning from our visitors that inspired our trip to Cape Town. So just a quick overview. I'll give some context about the purpose of the trip. We'll dive a little deep into the 4 places that we visited while we were in town and quickly jump into some lessons learned. Sharon, I'll split it at each site. We can share kind of significant takeaways or things that stood out just so that we can alternate it. Okay. First, I wanted to start with a little bit of context about the institution itself. So the National African American Museum was opened in 2016. So since then, we've welcomed approximately 11.5 million visitors. We do approximately 1.6 million a year. That's what we finished at last year. And on a single day in the museum, we could see 11,000 people. Of those visitors, 1 million of them have been international visitors, representing over 200 plus countries. But the figure at the bottom right-hand corner is a big part of why I tell that story. The Smithsonian Institution operates 364 days a year. So that means that there are frontline visitor staff in the museum every day of the year except for our Christmas holiday. So a big part about the trip was not only understanding how the experience in the exhibitions would impact visitors, but also how frontline staff were managing and navigating the experiences in these institutions and what a model for sustainable kind of self-care would look like for frontline staff. So a big part of it was get into this notion of how do you balance the visitor experience with the experience of the frontline staff who are delivering that experience. A little bit of context. So this image on the left is of a report that our office published in 2022, Sharon. It was a year-long study of our visitor experience. So over the course of a 364-day period, what insights could we glean from our visitors, understanding what their expectations of us was, understanding what parts of the trip really stood out to them, understanding the kind of emotional experience that they would have. So the trip to South Africa really served as an extension to this research. We were interested in understanding visitors' experience at our institution. So the museums and cultural heritage sites that we selected were ones where we saw parallels in terms of subject matter. So our museum deals with challenging subject matter from the period of enslavement. So slavery and freedom is a prominent exhibition, followed by the era of segregation within the United States. Also, so the sites that we were working with also had similar challenging subject matter. What we were interested in is best practices related to supporting visitors and staff as they physically and emotionally navigated their sites. What we knew going into the museum, into the trip, was that our own visitors, when they come to our museum, they experience sadness, empowerment, and joy as three kind of powerful emotions over the course of their experience. And those three emotions are actually most associated with a superior visitor rating. So if we're trying to create an amazing experience for visitors, the stories that they come across or the objects that they come across, we knew that they should invoke a combination of all three of these emotions. And so with that, how would the institution not only deliver an experience that might invoke sadness, but how would they transition the sadness into a story of empowerment? And then how could that potentially translate to joy? And then what would that mean ultimately for the frontline visitor staff that is delivering that experience? So it was a very specific thing that we were in search of when we went, but it was, I think, it was extremely insightful. So I'll start with the first place we visited, the Ezekiel Slave Lodge. The thing that was really great about our visit to the Slave Lodge is that we already had contacts there. Paul Tintle and Shanaz were curators that we were able to get in contact with at the institution because of the existing relationship and connection that our institution had. So there are objects within the collection at the Ezekiel Slave Lodge that are also on display here in our museum. The image on the left is kind of one of the plaques that has the logo of our museum next to the Ezekiel Museum. When we visited the Slave Lodge, the parallel point was actually our own Slavery and Freedom exhibition in the history galleries. When visitors to our site come into the museum, this content is some of the most visited content we have in the museum. The exhibitions that feature these objects and artifacts, 80% of our visitors go to those spaces. The experience that they have in those spaces are often associated with feelings of pain and of sadness, and ultimately a sense of empowerment. And so the conversation around how do you, one, center an interpretation that allows for the voices of the enslaved people themselves to be present. And that was something that stood out to me when we were here, something that was really important to Shanaz and to Paul, is to ensure that that approach to interpretation was present. One thing that Shanaz also underscored was the kind of expectations of the American visitors to the institution themselves, and the idea that approach to the interpretation will be taken. or that they would be able to hear firsthand stories or narratives that align more with the experiences of those who were enslaved. The parallels and content definitely stood out. I came in with the expectation that would be there, but the passion that the curatorial and interpretation team had for making sure that those narratives were present also stood out to me as well. I'll pause just to give myself a moment here, and then Sharon, ask if there's anything particular from this trip that stood out to you as well.
Thank you, Herman. One of the things I've learned since working at the museum is, of course, you almost always, when you visit another museum, you have on your museum hat. And I think most of you probably understand that feeling. But it was also the opportunity to be a visitor. And one of the other things about one of the credos of the Smithsonian that I definitely embrace is the whole thing about the diffusion of knowledge. And so for me, this so broadened my appreciation of slavery writ large, because our focus obviously is African American history, and we focus a lot on the transatlantic slave trade. In one of the earlier photos, there's that picture that shows the slave trade that took place in, thank you, Herman. It broadened my perspective to better understand slavery writ large. And so this was just a really fascinating museum to visit. I loved the museum exhibit that dealt with names, last names, the months of the year. And I have to echo Herman's comment about Shanaz and Paul. They were wonderful hosts and partners and colleagues during our visit to the Slave Lodge. So I'll close that.
Yeah. No, thank you, Sharon. And I agree. I think the idea that this was an opportunity for us to step into the shoes of visitors again was really powerful. One of the kind of byproducts of coming to work every day in an institution that interprets such challenging content is that you eventually become used to it over time. I could walk myself through and I could walk visitors through the exhibition and keep a bit of emotional distance between myself and the content in a way that it was more challenging when I was here, when I was physically in the space. And I appreciated that. I leaned into it, again, allowing myself to feel the types of emotions that visitors often say that they feel when they come to our exhibitions. And the other thing that I noticed before we go to the next site was after we left the space, I think originally when we were putting our itineraries together, we had plans of visiting multiple sites in a single day to make the most of the trip. But it was the idea that after we left the place, we needed to stop. We needed to eat. We needed to emotionally process everything that had come up during the trip. And I think that was a really good reminder of kind of some of the weight that our visitors would feel. While physically we had only been to one site so far and had only walked across a few floors and a few spaces, emotionally, we needed a moment to pause and reflect in the space. So yeah, the first stop, I think, really set the tone, because that model of us as a group of museum professionals visiting a site, then stopping to have kind of dinner or lunch, a meal after to kind of process what we had saw, became a kind of consistent rhythm as we visited other sites. The next site we visited was the Robben Island Museum. We knew so the conversation that's happening at Robben Island is a conversation centered around the period of apartheid in South Africa, and there are some parallels in terms of the exhibition content we have for the period of segregation within the United States. I think that was one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is because Robben Island is a World Heritage Site, they get large volume, tourism volume. So our institution is located on the National Mall within the US. So we're also at the kind of heart of cultural heritage tourism industry. So I was curious to see not only how the interpretation in the exhibition space would parallel, but also how this experience would be delivered continuously. Some of the things that we were taking note of were some of the signage right? The actual physical distance of the site from the Cape Town coast and the actual experience itself. So these are some photos from our group, and we had an opportunity to have a guided experience. I think some of the things that stood out for me with this was, one, the interpreter himself being a person who was formerly imprisoned at Robben Island. I think one of the things that immediately stood out to me from a visitor's perspective is the power in hearing a firsthand account of someone's story, of someone's experience. And I think because of the kind of specific focus of our trip, the second thing that came up for me is, what is the experience like retelling a narrative of what may have been one of the most traumatic parts of your life every day to multiple tourism groups throughout the course of a day? Because we were paying attention to the fact that when you come in, you're put on buses, there are multiple buses, and each interpreter is maybe seeing approximately 3 to 4 groups per day. One of the questions we did have an opportunity to ask directly was, how does retelling the story actually impact him? And one of the answers that he shared was that a part of it was cathartic in a way. It was helpful and healing in a way to be able to tell that story and to make sure that other people are aware of what happened. But Robben Island, I think, was one of the first sites that we visited that the potential toll or impact of interpreting these stories continuously for large cultural heritage tourism audiences was at the forefront, and started to reflect on ways or what approaches to rest for staff look like, on what approaches to collective healing and care look like for staff as well. So that was one of the big things for me from the Robben Island visit. And Sharon?
Definitely the experience of having the narrator and having to tell those really hard stories about his experiences. And as Herman said, just being very mindful of him having to repeat those on a regular basis and wanting to show respect and deference to that. We were a large group. There were some young people in the group, and sometimes young people do get a little rowdy, and there was some shushing of it, but it's just, I think, juggling all of that. And I think another conversation that we ended up having once we had a chance to get back and talk with our teammates in the office was the real question of, when you have people who can give you a firsthand narrative, and how do you capture and continue that when people are aging out of the conversation? And I think being very mindful when you think of interpretation, how museums are finding ways to capture their stories so that the stories will continue. We talk about World War II history, the Holocaust, and in this case, the experience, firsthand experiences at Robben Island. That's really area of concern that we need to be mindful of and preserve. I think that was also another big takeaway.
Yeah, absolutely. So after the Robben Island visit, I think the ritual was cemented after that, because we stopped and we had lunch, had an opportunity to again process. Again, even though we're museum professionals, even though we've been trained in a space that tells similar stories, challenging subject matter, we still needed rest, still needed an opportunity to process everything. And I think it was, again, powerful to feel that in my body again, as a professional that had created a little bit of emotional distance as well. The next site, last one from Robben Island, here we go, was the District 6 Museum. So the conversation centers around the racially mixed suburb and the subsequent destruction under apartheid. The kind of interpretive narrative that plays out around District 6 has broad parallels to a narrative we have within the museum around redlining, urban renewal, these policies within the US from the 1930s to approximately 1968 that led to the mass destruction of Black and brown neighborhoods across the United States. So that period of mass displacement, at the hands of specifically racially motivated policies. There are parallels in the stories and in the interpretation. The tour guide we had here was lovely. I think I remember as a warm spot within the museum experience. Specifically, this was a neighborhood that she grew up in as a child. And I think the approach to interpretation here, again, is kind of giving you the firsthand experience of people who lived in the neighborhood, but also recreating the warmness of the neighborhood. I think the feeling that I had in this museum paralleled the kind of emotional arc for our own visitors. The idea that throughout the course of the 1 hour tour that we took, I felt sadness, right? I felt a sense of empowerment in the ways that kind of progress had been made, but also a sense of joy, just solely deriving from the tour guide herself in the ways that she was interpreting and navigating the experience itself, and the way that she was able to bring humor and levity, I think, to the experience. It really stood out. Yeah, and I think the thing that, again, we were paying attention to in the space was that prior to our group having an opportunity to have a tour, we watched her finish a tour right before. And then right after she got done with our group, she immediately went on to the next group as well. And so this idea that we spent approximately 45 minutes to an hour with her, the assumption is that the group before and then the group after that as well, at least in the time that we're there, approximate 3 hour continuous block of interpretation. Again, of an experience that has deeply personal and emotional ties. It was the approach that we were seeing. And again, additional thoughts that were coming up around not only how do we craft the narratives that are powerful and personal, but how do we deliver the experience in a way that's sustainable for the folks delivering it. Sharon?
I second everything you said. Yes.
Absolutely. Okay, and then the last stop we made was actually to the U.S. consulate in Cape Town. We had an opportunity to masquerade as diplomats for the day. I think this provided an opportunity to have a 30,000-foot view of the conversation. I think one of the takeaways here was around the growth of U.S. tourism to South Africa and the ways that some of those macro trends are impacting or have the potential to impact interpretation within the institutions themselves. It reminded me of something that Shanaz had alluded to in the Ezeko slave lodge that we visited, the idea that some of the American tourists to the space came with an expectation that there would be interpretations that centered the perspective of the enslaved. The idea that was just a baseline expectation, while that necessarily isn't, while that approach to interpretation is something that they were pushing for and gaining more support for, the kind of push from the audiences themselves also lent itself to that. Yes, I think that macro conversation around kind of cultural heritage tourism more broadly being a force that I think a lot of cultural heritage sites in their own ways have to contend with was something that stood out to me when we were here at the consulate. Sharon?
I think what I would add to this, which is also speaking to our visit writ large, that having the opportunity to see more of Cape Town was also very beneficial to our visit. Just being able to physically go to these sites, but also to see neighborhoods. And I will say sometimes we here in Washington, D.C. take that kind of personally, because a lot of people come to Washington and they only see the government buildings, or they focus on one part of town and not know that there are a lot of vibrant neighborhoods with different characters around these potential sites. Knowing that we did not see everything, but the opportunity to get out and see different parts of Cape Town and different neighborhoods was also very beneficial and enjoyable for our visit.
Thank you. And now I think we're getting close to the end because I do want to be mindful of the time. Some of the key takeaways. I think right off the top, it was reinforcing the importance of cultural heritage tourisms across the globe, specifically ones that we were saying that discuss the history and the impact of the slave trade. So UNESCO had a 10-year project that they launched to focus on the impact of the transatlantic slave trade as a global phenomenon. And so it was, I think, a great effort that called to action a lot of different institutions, be they academic institutions, interpretation sites, memorial sites, and the scholars and practitioners who do this work to contribute to a collective body of work. I think the trip just reinforced the importance of that, because while we found ourselves all the way across the globe in Cape Town, South Africa, the narratives that we were telling and the impact of those narratives felt very familiar, hit very close to home. It also presented an opportunity to have deeper discussions around cultural heritage institutions that address this emotionally charged subject matter, and the idea that collectively there is a pivot towards interpreting or bringing in this responsibility of collective healing and global well-being for both visitors to these institutions and for the staff that work in these institutions. That the idea that collective healing and social justice and global well-being for all is an extension of one of the UNESCO initiatives. The other piece was continuing to consider the impact of the cultural heritage tourism industry on daily operations as a key visitor attraction to the National Mall. So the Smithsonian at large, while we benefit from the traffic that the tourism industry brings, there hasn't been, or there wasn't, a lot of direct interface with the tour operator companies themselves that ultimately bring the visitors and the travelers. One of the things we did as an immediate action after this trip was set up meetings to actually sit down and talk to the tour operators and those whose businesses are centered around cultural heritage tourism, to just get an understanding about how they're marketing and positioning our museum and our institution within the kind of broader tourism packages that they're selling. And then finally, collecting data on visitor and staff experience and sharing the findings will continue to drive innovation and iterative learning in the museum field, because a lot of ways that we approach kind of success metrics now, there's a conversation around visitor satisfaction scores that allow visitors to give us feedback on their experience, but also pairing those very intentionally now with employee satisfaction scores that give the employees who delivered that experience an opportunity to also voice concerns or to make clear things that worked. So I think just at a simple level, expanding the scope of responsibility to not only include the ways that we interpret and create emotional journeys for visitors, but the way we factor in the impact of those journeys on our staff that we need to sustain these experiences over time. And I'll pause right there to hopefully leave us some time for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Herman and Sharon. That is just, yeah, I didn't really know what to expect from today. And now I'm just feeling, wow, it's so true. We always look at the audience. We always are so worried about our visitors, and we're always saying everything's about the visitors. But in actual fact, especially when it comes to difficult topics, you can't just look at the audience. You have to consider what the staff are going through. You have to consider that they need their space. They need recovery time. They need to figure out how best to deal with, maybe they come up with someone difficult who sees the past in a different way, and they start like nailing them with all sorts of questions where they're like, hold on a second, I'm telling you my experience, and I'm telling you what my family and friends experienced. That's a whole side of things to try and help the staff figure out how to navigate those kinds of things is really important. So thank you for highlighting that. Wow, it's really, It's been fascinating. I just want to see here that Joan actually made a good point. Let me just go back here. Firstly, she said, my experience is that wearing the hat makes for taking away so much more. There's two sides to that. I think it does, because we know what to look for in a way. We tend to want to read signs. We tend to look especially for things. So if it's difficult to find something, we really want to know. So we go and look for it. Whereas a normal visitor might just go, oh, whatever, and carry on. I'm not going to waste my time trying to find X, Y, Z. So I think in that way, we learn so much and see so much more sometimes because we want to. It's our thing. So we're going to put the effort in. Joan, I'm coming to you now. Then also, I really like the comment of we carry a huge responsibility to authentically tell personal stories. So in many instances where staff may not have naturally had personal experiences and excellent staff training, that training is essential. And the personal experiences need to be created, which obviously is a whole lot more difficult than having the actual person with the experience. But Joan, seeing as those are your comments, how about you flesh it out and carry on?
Thank you for the opportunity, Heidi. And I really appreciate the presentations. They've made me think and affirmed some of the stuff that might have been in the back of my head. So I come from a facility that two organizations that deal with nature conservation, and the vast majority of visitors don't really give a fig about nature conservation. And the staff who join us often don't know anything about nature conservation. So I took home some really strong lessons from what the two of you experienced in your trip. And one, I would really love to learn a little bit more about your staff satisfaction surveys and how you do those, because as Heidi said, I think that's really important. And secondly, I'm one of those very irritating audience members. I've never had a bad guide because I ask 5,000 questions. So the guide's exhausted by the time they leave me. And that's because I'm wearing that hat, Heidi. So that's where I'm coming from. I try very hard at the start of a tour with somebody else not to pay too much attention to the delivery, but to listen for the story. And that's why for me, it's really, really important that staff have some personal experience to be able to tell that story. And the two of you epitomize that by coming to South Africa and listening to those stories from another angle in another country. And that, I know when I've done that, when I've gone overseas, it's just made me think much harder about where I live and the impact that has or should have on my dealing with people. Thank you so much to both of you.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. And I will say our thought processes are similar right now in terms of, I think the point in the chat, not everyone on the staff has experiences with the kind of content or subject matter or personal experiences with them. A part of what I'm preparing to do now with the team is this in-house immersive experience. So a part of what the curatorial team has done an amazing job of is capturing these stories through the objects in the collection, the personal approaches to some of these stories, some of the macro socio-political moments that are happening, right? And delivered amazing exhibitions. One, not all of the folks who come on staff, depending on what their role is, have actually spent time in our exhibitions haven't had an opportunity to even receive a kind of tour of the museum itself as a part of kind of standard onboarding. So that becomes a low-hanging fruit moment. But beyond that, there are a number of more immersive experiences that the museum can offer, particularly if there's someone interested in researching their own family history or researching their genealogy, or something as more broadly applicable as the ways that we encourage our visitors to preserve their own stories, right? There are objects and artifacts in our everyday lives that are valuable, stories that matter to us, to our families, to our friends, and guiding them along this journey to see the value in those everyday objects in their lives that relate to the work that we're doing here, and challenging them to be the people that preserve them, right? Something as simple for me was during the holidays, my family is from New Orleans, Louisiana, in the southern part of the US, and a meal that we love is gumbo. It's a pot of stew from my grandmother has the recipe. But the museum itself offers a free online digital toolkit to help you record oral histories, family histories. And so this past holiday season, I, for the first time, sat my grandmother down and we recorded that recipe together. And it was me challenging myself to do what I would want the visitors to do, but also recognizing that I needed to make room for the staff to do that. That experience was transformative for me personally. I've worked in museums for close to 10 years now, but that was my first time actually bringing it into my own home, into my own life. And so now that assignment to think about your favorite meal and actually take the step of using the museum's tools to preserve that history, that today living history, is something that I want to offer to the team. Even if that's the one time they do it, they now have a deeper understanding or appreciation for the role of preservation, right? The role of kind of archiving of family history, and hopefully feel a deeper connection to the work that we do here. So I think, Joan, the simplest way, I am thinking more intentionally about how to expose the staff to the types of experiences that we design for visitors in a way that hopefully inspires them or allows them to feel a bit more connected to the work.
Wow, that sounds like a great idea. It seems so obvious because we keep saying connect to the local people and make sure that everybody is a part of the museum and it's their museum. But what better way than to actually say, tell us your story, give it to us, and let's make it part of the next exhibit. Not just, no, I think also when you have focus groups and things like that, people don't necessarily open up as much.
Yeah.
Always. Whereas if you're sitting there with your gran, that's already so personal. And then you're sitting and you chat about the recipe and you say, oh, remember when Auntie so-and-so did this and this? And then it's like a whole experience just doing that. You haven't even necessarily been through the museum or anything, but now you've gone through your own history in your head and chatting to each other and bringing up memories. And I think it's a great thing. Really good idea.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll let you know how the staff feel about it.
Please do. Amy, would you like to ask something?
Yes, you know me, I ask a million questions. Sharon, you're not the only one. Thank you so much for the presentation. So I work at Aziko, one of our sites is the Slave Lodge, so I will work with Shanaz. It was really interesting to hear your feedback. Thanks for coming. And I'm very glad you did connect with Shanaz. She's incredible. With so much respect for what she does and how she does it. I have a few questions. I think maybe just to start with that oral history toolkit's amazing. Is it available online on your website?
It is, yes. And I can share that. So I'll follow up with the staff survey and then with the toolkit as well.
Thanks. I think it's making me also think of it wasn't anything to do with it. I think actually it was connected to Iziko, but it was an initiative to sort of decolonize the information around our collections, and it was done by a group of people, rural KZN. They called it Museum in a Box, and it was a very similar oral history project, and it was very rewarding, and being able to actually link those objects to objects in our collection and be able to get all of that additional data from it that actually was personal with those intangible stories, which was really the intangible heritage stuff. I've gone to your museum. It was a very poignant visit. I think the really things that stood out for me was the food at the end, being able to experience your culture or your food. And we see it a lot on TV, but being able to actually experience it was really great. I loved what you did there. And I think that's inspired a colleague of ours to do something similar when we get our cafe up at one of our sites. But it was a seminal moment for me, was connecting with a random visitor over a cast iron skillet, just a pan. I think it was up towards the top levels, and just realizing how personal stories and objects and how that sort of bridges this conversation. It's a conversation starter, which is really amazing. And how we can have the same object halfway across the world, but have similar memories around it, which was quite cool. I was really interested. You had a lot of reflection spaces to break, because it's very heavy content. And maybe in South Africa, and maybe because of the spaces we work in, I've become quite desensitized to it. And I think because it was such a similar history to our histories, it was an interesting experience for me, having been in South Africa, gone to these museums and working in the space. But I found the reflection spaces really good. Even if it isn't heavy in terms of how I've desensitized, it also allowed me to stop and reflect, and even reflect on my desensitization of it, which was interesting. I'm interested, your interactive spaces you have kept at the top. How do your visitors find that, as they're not integrated? I know there were a few interactive elements integrated into that, but they went throughout the exhibit. And I could see the practicality of why you did that, but I'd like to know what your visitors thought about that. Last question, I promise. You mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, there was a customer survey. You highlighted sadness, empowerment, and joy, the emotional ones. Are you willing to share that survey, or maybe in another session take us through what that looks like? Because I think it's such a good foundation. And as we have many different sites, so similar to the Smithsonian, we'll have sites that are focused on natural history, or a site on the slave lodge, and then we have the Boer Kaap, which is a different history, but being able to look at what those metrics are for different sites, obviously you want different emotions evoked. If you could share that, it would be amazing. Or maybe another session, Heidi, suggestions where we go through one or two of those surveys would be amazing, if you're willing to share, of course. And just thank you to both of you.
Absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate the thoroughness of the comments. I'm going to see if I can go back through them in order to respond. One, the conversation with the cafe and the food, I think it was, so reflecting on our experience there, what we were doing was visiting these sites, feeling the weight of the emotional experience, and then eating immediately after. And so one of the things that we now do standard for visitors is recommend that immediately after visiting the history galleries, which is our most challenging content, that you stop into the cafe. It's a simple thing, right? Some people are doing it automatically. The space is designed to where it's the first thing you actually see when you exit the space. But I think taking that step in the beginning, when we're first preparing you for your journey, to want to let you know what emotions that you're most likely to experience, and to let you know that the museum can take care of you in the form of food. You can eat those feelings, is what we want to start to work into the scripts for the frontline folks at the museum. So yeah, that pairing of heavy experiences and food was one of the ideas that came away from the South Africa trip specifically. Just reflecting on, again, my experience to be able to sit back into the shoes of a visitor.
Yes, South Africans love our food, just so that.
No, yeah, I enjoyed everything that I ate when I was in South Africa. The story about the cast iron skillet is such a thing that we are also working in. There's a book called The Participatory Museum that I absolutely love. It's about how
I love it.
Yes. How are you?
Although, if I can jump in, sorry, I went to a decolonization ICOM session that was sponsored by you guys, and I had a lovely, interesting conversation with, I think it was your director, and speaking about that book. And she did highlight that it's lovely, but it's for rich people in LA, or I don't know where it was. And it made me feel a little bit more okay that we can't reach all of those goals as the kind of museum budgets we have. So frothed over it for years, and then I had to take a step back and go, okay, it's okay if we can reach one or two of them. But yeah, sorry.
No, but I think if the takeaway from me in the book and the connection to the story is how are you staging these sort of social experiences, right? How are you setting it so that happenstance interaction you had connecting with the visitor over a personal object happens more predictably, right? Because we are able to use the collective site of the museum to stage these different visitor experiences and more predict these outcomes. When I'm thinking about the museum, I think about it across the entire thing. We have a collection of different exhibitions, and each of those exhibitions, of course, have very clear interpretations. But during a normal visitor journey, they're hitting 6 or 7 of those, right? And what is the kind of arc of that experience that they're having? And how can I bake in these moments along the way where they have an opportunity to connect more with the people that they came with very intentionally, right? And staging these social participatory moments is what we're experimenting with kind of actively right now. So thank you for sharing that story. It's extremely affirming. That's the ways that we'll continue to experiment in-house. I completely agree with the importance of reflective spaces. The memory room, the light cone within the Ezekiel slave lodges, it felt the same. And I appreciated that it was there because I needed it in the moment that I came across it. So yeah, definitely echoing the power of reflective spaces. The interactive floor is loved by kids and adults alike across the museum. It's actually one of the few places that people can learn through doing. We have a step interactive. Stepping is a part of Greek life within US colleges. And there's an interactive that allows you to actually learn right? Polyrhythms are happening. So people are stepping and marching in sync. That it's people recognize that's one of the few places that can happen, right? And yeah, the interactive floors are loved and adored by folks because it gives you an opportunity to engage with the content in a different way. They're typically heavy traffic. Our school groups love them. We love having the option to say it to families that come into the museum because it's just a different experience. And yeah, so we have the report that I said that was one of the catalysts to, I showed it briefly. I can share that report as well. So you all can have that information. I'm more than happy to share that along with the kind of staff surveys that we do.
Can I just jump in and say, I dropped my email in the chat. Please feel free to follow up that way, and then we can certainly get it distributed out.
Thanks, Sharon. And if you could pass it to me, then I could send it out to our whole mailing list as well, because I'm sure there'll be other members who maybe watch the YouTube version of this and then want to get an eye on it as well. That's okay. If you wouldn't mind, we have one more question. Joan's been waiting very patiently in the wings. Joan, please go ahead. Joan?
Sorry, I couldn't get to unmute. Can I ask for anybody to possibly share with us it has got to be brief, but an example of a reflective area, and just give us one example of what's in it, and yeah, what's in it? How does it work?
Yeah, I can share my screen one more time to show the one that Amy, maybe you can talk a little bit through it, the one that's in Ezekiel.
They're just down spaces to not be overwhelmed with content, spaces you can, in some cases, sit. The ones, if I remember correctly, it's a good few years ago in your museum, was spaces that you could actually record videos, so reflect. We went into this small video booth and we're able to reflect. We've used them as just spaces where you sit, or there's very heavy content. You just need to shift away. And I suppose one could say the restaurant would be a reflective space in some ways. I think each exhibit needs its own style of reflective space, but it's just a quieter, as far as I would know, it's a quieter experience.
Can I just also add, we have what we call the contemplative court, which is it's a water feature. It's like a waterfall. And that is also one of the options when someone exits from our history galleries. They do come out, there it is. And there's seating there. If you look there to the bottom photo on the right. And so you're in this space where you've got that water feature, so you're hearing the falling water, but it's a moment where people sometimes just go and sit just for a few moments. They may have conversations, they may not, but it is definitely a calming and a reflective, an opportunity to reflect on visit.
Yeah, one space that I can think of, which I've always really enjoyed, is the kelp forest at Two Oceans Aquarium. I would actually prefer it if there weren't any signs there, but obviously the signs are there for people who want to know more. But just when you've been through the chaos of the main part of the aquarium and you've come out of the freshwater exhibits with the penguins, you've had the stinky, noisy penguins and everything, you come out into the space where there's just tranquility, really. And you're watching the kelp swaying, and I think there's some light music just in the background, and it's quite darkish. There's seating available, and that kind of thing to me is just the perfect spot for you to breathe and go, what have I just seen? What have I just experienced? Yeah, it can be a bench, it can be a specially set up area, it can be a place where you have something to look at that basically might not be too much to look at, like a waterfall or a water feature. So it's any kind of space that just gives you that break of constant input of all sorts of things. Because if you think our experiences are very full of stuff, that's why they need quiet times and special experience times for people like autistic people and that, because they can't handle all the input that comes with a normal visit. All of those people, all the noise, all the lights, all the signs, all the animals. There's just so much that goes on. the rest of us who don't have that kind of a, not necessarily disability, but we don't have an issue with oversensitivity, we tend to be able to just block things out and focus in on the thing that we want to look at or whatever. But I think even as you were saying, Herman, with especially when it's a personal experience and you're having all these emotions, you might not have seen everything and experienced everything, but the 1 or 2 things or 10 things that you saw has probably been like a heavy load on you, and you need that time to just go and think about it and gather yourself towards yourself and be able to carry on. Because if you go from a busy experience in a zoo, aquarium, or a museum, and you're suddenly out into the streets with cars and people and sun and lights and birds, it's just, whoa, you can't take it in. So yeah, it's just basically any space that you can make that's just a break, a pause, not so much as everywhere else kind of space.
And even more essential when you're dealing with heavy content.
Yeah.
Even if I felt desensitized, there were moments I needed that. So it's essential in many spots.
I'm most interested.
The question of re-traumatization is a really interesting one that we have to grapple with.
Joan, what was that?
I say I'm interested that you don't always feel you have to put something into that area to make people think. I don't know, Heidi, what your experience and Amy in terms of South Africans, we are pretty desensitized to what we live in daily. So I don't think we do much reflection. We do a little bit of just survival. And I find it interesting that you can use a range of methods for that reflective space. Thank you.
Even something like music, I can't think of it offhand at the moment, but I was listening to a talk the other day. There was a lady doing a TED talk, and she was talking about music and talking about different ways of making the experiences more accessible for people who have a hearing disability and a visual disability. And if you have a space just with some quiet music, even if maybe the music is related somehow to what they've just seen, like you say, Joan, for the people who want input, you can get input out of that music if you want to. You can think about it and go, how is it connected and what are they saying? But if you've had enough, you can also just switch off and go and just enjoy the tune or whatever. Okay, so anyway, we need to go. The time is up. Sharon, yes, what would you like to say?
Oh, I was just going to note, Herman needs to go to another meeting. He's backed up scheduling wise. So I wanted to say I can stay for a couple of more minutes but Herman does need to transition. It's his meeting that he needs to go to.
Yes, not a problem. Thank you very much. We did go over time, but as you can see, we have this thirst for knowledge and wanting to get as much from everyone as possible. So thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Thank you everybody else for coming. And please stay in touch via email. And if anyone has questions, I'll pass them on to Sharon and Herman.
Perfect. Thank you all so much for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for your time. Bye, everyone. Lovely to see you all.
Thanks very much.